Good evening, everyone. It brings me great pleasure to finally welcome you all to this year's Invitational Geneva Debate between the Graduate Institute and Oxford Union. The Geneva Debate, since its inception, had two fundamental aims: to raise a political and policy question with short-term and long-term impacts on our lives, and to place this question in front of students with a standing interest in them. At its core, this debate, much like all the other Geneva debates we've organized, has been to allow students a platform to voice their opinions and engage in constructive argumentation. In collaboration with the British Embassy in Bern, this debate aims to navigate the crossroads of youth, environment, and accountability. The idea behind the motion and concept for this debate was to push environmental concerns into the realm of accountability and address the tensions that exist in the search for this accountability. To place ecocide in IHL, International Humanitarian Law, or International Criminal Law, animates a very specific mandate, response, and justification, which can impact what accountability and justice will look like, as well as the politics that will influence the processes. It is my sincere hope that this debate manages to flesh out these nuances. After months of preparation and training, this invitational is a culmination of a series of deliberations and coordinations to rope in various stakeholders that have a vested interest in the motion we have for you today. With that, I would like to first introduce the debaters for today. On the 15th of February, the British Embassy had held a coin toss to decide the sides for this motion. The Graduate Institute was given side proposition and will be supporting the motion. The team is comprised of Myrtle Cleona-Priddy, Jessica Curry, and Sohini Chakrabarti. Opposing them and the motion is Oxford Union, comprised by Heather Lee, Gabrielle Lynn, and Samuel Shaw. The motion before us today is: the House supports ecocide as a principle in international humanitarian law. For the purposes of this debate, ecocide has been defined as unlawful or wanton acts committed with the knowledge that there is substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. I wish the debaters a fruitful session. I now call the House to order and open the debate. Hear, hear. I now invite the Prime Minister to open the debate.
I'll be taking points of information at the 6th minute and 30th second.
You have the floor for 8 minutes.
To quote the late lion philosopher Mufasa, "We are all connected in the great circle of life. We are born and gain nourishment, shelter, and even the very air we breathe is derived from the ecosystems around us. Our ecosystems need us, and just as importantly, we need them. We are all connected. This is why we staunchly believe that criminalizing the deliberate destruction of the environment empowers us to extend this great circle of life that relies on the timeless synergy between us and our vital ecosystems. This criminalization is necessary when, for instance, our abundant rainforests are cut down by a large conglomerate to amass $165 billion in profits and result in polluted water, displaced communities, and even death. We ask, how can these crimes against the environment not be seen as crimes against humanity? This is why we, as the proposition, support the addition of ecocide as a principle in international humanitarian law in order to erode this binary. For the purpose of this debate, we understand ecocide to be unlawful or wanton acts committed with the knowledge that there is substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. I will commence the proposition's argument by aiming to do 3 things. Firstly, showcase why the ecocide law is necessary. due to the urgency of the climate crisis, and also to diminish the binary between environmental and humanitarian rights. And secondly, justify why we feel specifically international humanitarian law is a suitable mechanism for its enactment. And finally, in reference to the ICC, I'll briefly outline the benefits of our proposal. So the crux of our argument is that we believe ecocide should be added as a principle in international humanitarian law because it's necessary to create a link between the urgency of the climate crisis and erode the binary between environmental and humanitarian rights. Now, I could stand here and concoct a perfect cocktail of facts, figures, and fatalistic descriptions for you in order for you to understand the urgency of the crisis. But you already know this. Due to greenhouse emissions, it's been the hottest decade in history, and ice caps are melting, and by 2030, there could be no Vanuatu, the Maldives, or Bangladesh. However, what we propose is that there is a season of inertia because people don't see the link between the environment and humans. We see climate crisis as something happening far away in some island, some forest, to some people. However, we should understand that the climate crisis causes us, when we lose our homes, to also lose our human rights. When we lose our homes, we lose our human right to adequate standard of living. We lose our human rights to the right to life. And for indigenous communities who are targeted by deforestation, how can they claim their human right to a free and fair world? The proposition believes that the ecocide law that advocates for the environment as a humanitarian law both addresses the urgency of climate crisis and also shows that the impingement on human rights is connected to the impingement on environmental rights. And maybe the opposition may label this as an exaggerated conflation, but we want to emphasize this connection. Secondly, we want to mention why specifically we want to use international humanitarian rights as the mechanism. Firstly, because we believe that the impacts of armed conflicts, which IHL encompasses, are aligned with the impacts of ecocide. And secondly, because we feel that the enactment of ecocide also accounts for the environmental destruction that happens during armed conflicts. So firstly, the impacts of armed conflict, if we take, for example, the war in Ukraine, has resulted in 8 million refugees across Europe, the mass destruction of cities, and food insecurity globally. And we can see how similarly in Brazil, the mass deforestation has led to the displacement of the Yanomami tribe, continued destruction of their sacred land, and food insecurity and malnutrition. Can you not see parallels here? And what is the difference between the people of Ukraine and the Yanomami tribe? The difference is one group's plight is currently covered under IHL because it happened during armed conflict, and the others is not. However, we as a proposition see that there are immense parallels between impacts of armed conflicts, which IHL has legal jurisdiction over, and ecocide, which it currently does not. This needs to change. Secondly, ecocide inclusion in IHL would account for the environmental destruction that happens during armed conflict, another connection. In the war in northern Iraq, fire started in a scorched earth policy to terrorize civilians, lasted for 4 months, and resulted in mass CO2 emissions, in addition to torched crops, poisoned soil, and polluted water. My fellow speakers and I propose that the addition of ecocide in IHL would propel the environment from the shadows and enable us to prosecute the main perpetrators of environmental destruction during armed conflict. Lastly, I will outline the hopeful outcomes of the ecocide law in IHL by noting how the use of the International Criminal Court creates a culture of accountability for the worst perpetrators of ecocide. We know there are already a barrage of local environmental laws that attempt to have the same impact as the ICC. However, what we want to emphasize is that the ICC is the only international court with the jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, and hopefully soon ecocide. And we think that this is necessary because corporations view local legislation as technicalities to negotiate or to budget for in compensation crimes. We feel that if this becomes a war, ministers cannot issue permits for it. I'll accept your point of information.
How successful has international humanitarian law been at preventing war crimes in Ukraine?
Thank you for your question. We will further address this in the upcoming speeches. Thank you. Ministers cannot issue permits for it, insurers cannot underwrite it, and banks cannot finance them. This leads to the additional hopeful outcomes that will be outlined in further details in my fellow speakers. We will mention the increase of the likelihood of achieving justice for victims of ecocide, and lastly, hope to change the public perception of what constitutes a human right. In summary, I hope I've expressed the need for ecocide as a principle in international humanitarian law due to the urgency of the climate crisis and need to diminish the binary between environmental and humanitarian rights. Secondly, why we feel specifically international humanitarian law is a suitable mechanism, and through ICC, what our hopeful outcomes would be. It now remains the burden of the opposition to convey why the enactment of ecocide would detrimentally harm our climate, a harm that they have to prove eclipses our current state of environmental destruction, and provide mechanisms besides ours that would be enactable in existing courts. We feel that we would win the debate if we are able to convey the relationship between human and environmental rights and how our main priority should be implementing a vital change in our current system. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 7 minutes, 39 seconds. I now call upon the Leader of Opposition. Madam Speaker, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
All right, thank you. Before I begin my speech, I just want to say thank you for inviting us here. It is an incredible pleasure to be able to debate against the Geneva Graduate Institute, and thank you for this opportunity. All right. If you are a citizen of Puerto Rico whose home is at risk of going underwater in the next 5 years, would you rather know that we are forging durable international coalitions to address the realities of climate change, or that 3 lawyers sitting in The Hague have gained the capacity to prosecute small farmers in the Amazon that is so far removed from your life that you don't care? Judges, we recognize the messy reality of the world in which we live. Instead of peddling principles that are high-minded and, yes, attractive, we are going to deliver you a roadmap for tangible change, how you actually create climate change progress on the ground, instead of through the courts, instead of through principles that do not affect the lives of the everyday citizen. Our case will have 2 components. First, why international law cannot enforce any meaningful change. Second, outlining what is necessary for climate change progress to occur, and how a new law upsets the already precarious balance of global diplomacy. We'll just be addressing the concept of international law as a whole because we think that the IHL is encompassed within the jurisdiction of a lot of the things of international law as a whole, and we'll be addressing the concept of international law writ large rather than focusing on the specifics between IHL versus international criminal law. I want to briefly address some refutation to the points that we get out of the Prime Minister. Ultimately, though, the main flaw in the government's case is that while they prove the necessity of climate change action, and while they prove that there is currently inaction, they do not provide to us as to why the routes through which international law is enforced provide any meaningful change and are able to create the types of action that they occur. It is unclear to me as to why the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice are able to get the types of claims that they occur. The International Court of Justice has not been able to stop the killing of civilians in Ukraine. It has not been able to stop war crimes. It has not been able to stop Russia from using chemical weapons in Syria. The ICJ and the ICC have proven themselves time and time again ineffective at stopping the very basic things in which they are so designed to prove. It is unclear why they get that change under their side of the House. Proposition's goal, then, is not to prove to us the necessity of climate change action. This is clear. We are not disputing that on-side opposition. Their burden is to prove to us that these courts themselves are the mechanism by which to do so, and by including them in these international courts, they have not disrupted the very precarious balance of power that belies our global community. All right. Firstly, on to the points about limiting this, about how this is about why the International Criminal Court is not the magic bullet that they think it is to be able to fix climate change progress. What can the ICC/ICJ actually accomplish? First, the jurisdiction of international courts is severely limited. Note that half of the world's population live in countries that are not under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Countries like the US, India, China, and Russia, which are the globe's biggest emitters, cannot be touched by ICC and have no legal obligation to abide by any of the ecocide laws that they want to include. Panel, just to put this into numbers, over 70% of the world's emissions and over 50% of the world's population lives in a country in which this law has no influence in. The second thing is, let's assume for now that the ICC does actually have capacity to implement these laws, to actually prosecute within the sizable proportion of the world. The question then becomes, who are they actually able to hold to account? Because one very important fact about the way the ICC and the ICJ work is that they cannot prosecute companies. They can only prosecute individuals. So any sufficiently big company, which are the types of crimes that we're talking about given that climate change is caused by multinational massive corporations, has a lot of middle management that obfuscates any responsibility that any individual has. A potential culprit can just point up and down the scale of the hierarchy and say that they were just taking orders. Even without corporate bureaucracy that we all know and despise, companies who are that are large enough to rise to the level of ICC prosecution have the best lawyers in the world. These lawyers also know that ecocide laws exist, so they have all kinds of ways to prevent this responsibility by crafting the language in which these companies use to shield any individual from responsibility. So you're not going to be able to actually target the culprits that they say are the primary driver of climate change as a whole. So in this regard, there is no culture of accountability that can exist. But thirdly, let's assume that even the ICC is able to identify a culprit within the corporate bureaucracy that exists and graces our world. The ICC relies on the goodwill of countries to extradite these culprits. They have no individual power to do so themselves. And countries of all kinds that are in the ICC, it is very much not in their interest to extradite to the ICC. In Canada, this requires the government being willing to extradite an oil CEO, that provides jobs and is key towards maintaining political stability of the oil sands in Alberta. In Nigeria, this means gambling on prosecuting people who bring in jobs and investment and long-term foreign development into your economy in sectors that, yes, may compromise the environment, but given that these governments care much more about economic development, it is unclear how they'll do so. I want to briefly outline the normative case here in direct response to how they say that this brings the environment and rights closer together. Because, again, perhaps this is where the ICC's value lies. To have any power to set norms, though, the ICC needs to be perceived as a community, as an institution that can set norms, that is able to tell us that their laws and the way in which they shape discourse between humanitarian and environment is actually of any value to the global community. In the past 40 years, all the ICC has shown itself in the eyes of the global community is to be wholly ineffective at achieving its stated goals and racist in its persecutions. The African Union has already tried to leave the ICC in 2016. The US has a law that allows the president to invade The Hague in case any US citizen is ever prosecuted. The ICC does not have the reputation necessary to set international norms that can lead to long-lasting change and policies countries implement both outside their borders, and within. All right. What is necessary then to create climate progress? So climate change is an inherently global problem. Pollution does not care about borders, and sea levels will not stop when America at Florida. Global problems require global solutions, and ultimately diplomacy is the driver of anything to fix climate change. There exists a freeloader problem right now with climate change. Right now, the cost of climate change, particularly for rich countries, are largely external. I don't suffer the cost of climate change, especially I'm from Canada. It gets warmer for me. That's honestly great, right? The costs of climate change for me are not actually that present. For the problem for a lot of rich countries, which are the biggest emitters in the world, they need to be able to internalize these costs, and the only ways in which they can do so is through global diplomacy. International diplomacy is also much more effective at accomplishing a lot of benefits compared to international law. International law's power is limited solely to prosecution. International diplomacy can accomplish bilateral agreements like technology transfer that solve inefficient farming practices which contribute towards climate change, by driving economic development that stops the poorest countries from burning coal, by building long-lasting and green infrastructures in countries that previously may not have access to it. The ICC can only rebuke, it cannot rebuild. Why won't international diplomacy happen? It is inherently hard. Countries are primed to care about their own interests, and governments view themselves as defending their people against the global anarchic arena. Underlying this question of global diplomacy, then, is a question of justice. How do we get countries to cooperate with each other? Countries in the global south are empirically responsible for a very, very small percentage of global emissions, but will bear the brunt of incoming climate change. It is German emissions that will cause the floods in Bangladesh. It is the West that causes the world around you, the air you breathe, the water you drink, to become deadly. It is then understandable why there exist tensions as to who the burden of solving climate change should fall on. The countries now get told that they have to fix a problem that they did not create. The solution often involves bitter costs on their own populations. It means not being able to accept contracts that can lift your citizens out of poverty, to accept housing developments that may destroy environments but put a roof over some people's heads. The introduction of the ecocide in international law gives power to an unjust organization to enforce an unjust law to exacerbate historical unjustness in climate change. The ICC is perceived as an extension of Western global hegemony. Of the 50 indictments ever given by the ICC, 46 have been to Arab and Black Africans. With the ecocide as a principle in international law, diplomacy and cooperation becomes impossible. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 11 seconds. I now call upon the Member of Government. Madam Speaker, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Thank you. In 2008, the Republic of Maldives issued a statement to the states party to the Rome Agreement, which called for international action when it comes to climate change. They warned that within the rise of 2 meters in sea level, their island nation would be essentially submerged. That means that climate change is something that encroaches on this country's borders, their way of life, economic and cultural, but also just the lives of citizens itself. 10 years later, a decade on in 2018, the Maldives are back with the same statement, and they express frustration with the inaction that comes from the international community since they've made this cry and this appeal. I'm going to read a section from that to you very quickly. The time is right to consider an amendment to the Rome Statute to criminalise ecocide. Countries at the front line of climate change do not have the luxury of time to negotiate. Look, side opposition can stand here and quibble about the difficulties of enforcing standards. But what we tell you on side proposition, I should say, is that if you don't have these international standards in the first place, then the environment and people's lives becomes a grabbing game for those with the most power, and that always leads to the worst case scenario. Myrtle's told you that protection from the ecocide is something which is a human right. I'm going to tell you and mechanise exactly how enshrining this as a human right allows individuals to actually be able to access this. So I'm going to be doing this in 2 ways. First of all, I'm going to be looking at the ICC's capacity to criminalise people and why we see it to be more likely on our side of the house than theirs, in direct contradiction to what you've just heard. And second of all, I'm going to be looking at creating a culture and a corporate culture in which ecocide becomes something which is intolerable. So those are 2 pieces of substantive that I'll be bringing to you. First, a little bit of rebuttal. We had 2 main points to come from the previous speaker. The first, a lot of it was about our motion being ineffective. And he had 3 reasons for this. The first is to do with the jurisdiction of the ICC, and second of all is the idea of can corporations be held accountable at all, and third of all is who are the type of people who tend to get criminalised. So to answer this first question on jurisdiction, I'm just going to flag that this is something that Sahini is going to be speaking about in her 3rd speech, so watch out for that then. But when it comes to the second case of can corporations be held accountable under our side of the house, a big part of my substantive is going to be dealing with this. Just 2 quick responses. Yes, we believe that corporations can be held accountable. This is why the EU, after COP26, is looking for criminalising individuals as part of, in order to get to corporations. Currently, we have a system where corporations can use something called a corporate veil in order to avoid responsibility for those at the top. We prefer our mechanism for achieving this. But I'm going to talk about that more in my speech. I want to point out as well that side opposition completely ignored the main substantive of Myrtle's speech when she talks about principles. She wasn't just saying that ecocide is something really bad and we need to look after the environment, which is true and we all agree it, but she said specifically that environmental rights are human rights, and we never got a response as to why that's not the case. The importance to this, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you believe at all that that's the case, if you believe any of her substantive when she talks to you about the victims of ecocide, then you have to see that principles are not just something to be ignored, right, ladies and gentlemen? We tell you that human rights exist as inalienable and indivisible. That means even if there's an individual across the world who can't access that human right, we would rather live in a world where the Charter exists and what these rights are enshrined. We'd rather have a normative world in which people know their rights are being infringed upon than when it's just business as usual, which is what we see as opposition's side of the house. When I look to see what the harm from opposition was at this point, given that we do think the principal point is still a valid point on our side of the house, we didn't get given an awful lot. The first was this idea of global diplomacy in general, and we don't think that global diplomacy has to be mutually exclusive at all with our motion. In actual fact, we see it to be something which gives, especially states with less bargaining power in international communities, something else to bargain with. This is a reason that the Republic of Maldives, for example, has been asking for ecocide to be enshrined in criminal law, because if you're a country with low bargaining power who tends to be screwed over by unfettered capitalism and greedy corporations, then you have very little with which to bargain in an international forum, in international diplomacy. Only under our side of the house do they now have the entire international apparatus with which to work in. Thirdly, and my final piece of rebuttal, is to this idea that our motion stops development for developing countries. 5 very quick responses. First of all, we want to tell you that we have not heard what, like, our motion doesn't ban pollution. We're not necessarily saying that if you're like a developing nation, that if you're India, you're now not allowed to have factories and now not allowed to have produce. We're saying we're not allowed to have ecocide. We haven't heard why it's inherent to banning ecocide that developing countries are not going to be able to secure contracts. What we do think is going to happen is the type of coercive contracts which are currently being made are less likely to appear on our side of the house. We see this, no thank you, as a very good thing. Because we tell you that the countries which are most affected by climate change are developing nations. If you allow development to occur allowing ecocide, then that's a situation in which Pacific nations become submerged due to some other government's choice. Thirdly, a third piece of response is that we think that it's important that development is in fact incompatible with ecocide because of what Myrtle tells you, that ecocide is a violation of human rights. That means you cannot be developing sustainably at the same time as like ruining an indigenous family's life. We don't see that this is a fair trade-off. We think that governments need to have pressure in order to take their countries forward without screwing over minorities in the process. Yes, I'll take a point of information.
Why is it not sufficient to prosecute ecocide on a domestic level by the countries where environmental damage happens?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking. That's a very good question. And in fact, it goes nicely onto my substantive, which is the kind of circumstances in which we see this motion and this mechanism for justice being so important. Because we tell you there's 2 scenarios where we envision people and individuals escalating a case of ecocide into international law. And it's where states either fail to have the capacity to prosecute it, or it's when states are just unwilling to have the capacity, unwilling to prosecute it. So examples of this look like in 2006, where the citizens of Côte d'Azur woke to find that overnight tons of hazardous waste had been internationally dumped by a Swiss corporation. What happens here is that the local government of Côte d'Azur is physically unable to prosecute the government because they have their headquarters somewhere else. These are kind of circumstances in which we see an international government and an international criminal court being essential in order to achieve justice. Other cases could be something like when indigenous Brazilian peoples in the Amazon were forcibly displaced because the head of their environmental section of their government had taken 200,000 American dollars in bribes in order to cut down their homes. There are situations where states and short-term governments will be either hostile to prosecuting ecocide or just unable to, in the 2 sort of scenarios that I've given you. These are situations in which you need an international court in order to move things forward to there. But finally, I want to talk about why we think that this is going to be so effective in changing corporate behavioural structures. Because one thing that was raised in a POI to Myrtle is, well, human rights law doesn't do very much at the moment to stop human rights abuses. We see that's not necessarily true. If you look at, for example, the change in mechanisms in corporations once they have a degree of pressure applied to them, if you look at, for example, the case of Shell in Nigeria, there really is a difference which is made there. We have several responses. First of all, just because human rights are difficult to uphold doesn't mean that they're not important to have. If we completely believed all of side opposition's analysis about how difficult it is to enforce ecocide as a principle in international law, we wouldn't have crimes against genocide being upheld. Yes, it was difficult to stop human rights abuses occurring in Ukraine, but the reason that families of victims are still pushing for these to be prosecuted after the event is because it's important to recognize when rights are violated, even just as a principle. But second of all, we see that there's the stakeholders at play here are different from just a despotic government or someone who doesn't necessarily have to reply to consumer pressures. We tell you that corporations are particularly salient when it comes to listening to consumer pressure, and because of that as well, we see that there's an extra incentive that exists on our side of the house. So because of all of the reasons that I've brought to you today, I'm very proud to stand on side proposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 14 seconds. And I call upon the member of opposition.
Ready?
You have the floor for 8 minutes.
Great. To clarify the debate so far, we agree with the government team that the planet is in peril, that sea levels are rising, that islands are going underwater, and that catastrophic weather events are becoming more common than ever. We do not disagree in principle that the climate is tied to our right to life, but this depends on which side actually better helps the environment in the long run. Where we do disagree with the government team is the nature of the action that we must take.
Because while they argue for the criminalization of environmental harm, we argue instead that ecocide law will burn the bridges that countries have worked for years to build, and it will rot the foundations of trust that future cooperation stands on. In my speech, I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'll talk about the enforceability of ecocide in IHL and ICL. There, I'm going to address the government case and show that the most impactful environmental crimes are not punishable by international law. Secondly, I'll talk about the drawbacks of adding ecocide as a legal principle, in which I'll explain what we stand to lose in terms of international cooperation and progress. And finally, I'll summarize the debate and show that the harms of the motion outweigh the benefits. But firstly, on their claim about how environmental rights are human rights. The issue with this argument is that there are a lot of human rights that are not enforced by the ICC. Rights like education, like freedom of expression, like the right to healthcare. Clearly, this debate is about something deeper than just making a link between the ICC and human rights that we generally agree are good to have. This must hinge on our ability to actually enforce these rights and whether or not enforcing them in an international arena is the best solution. Let's then talk about enforceability. So, Gov's case relies largely on ecocide law being possible to effectively enforce. But there are four main problems that Heather brought up in her speech about enforceability, many of which were not responded to. This undermines their case about the culture of accountability. They say we're quibbling on the definition. We say that their policy is actually ineffective. Four things then. Firstly, on capacity. This was not dealt with by the government team. The ICC has only ever indicted 50 people in its history. It's structurally incapable of trying every case of major environmental harm. Secondly, on jurisdiction, Heather's explained to you how nearly 70% of the world's emissions are created by countries that are not parties to the ICC. This includes China, the US, India, and Russia, among others. So even if you could enforce what you had, the countries that you had jurisdiction over, this barely makes a dent in global emissions. Thirdly, on extradition, given that the ICC has no police force, it's highly unlikely that countries will agree to extradite very politically important or economically important individuals to the ICC. But finally, on the definition that was brought up by the government team on ecocide, let's talk about the legalese here. The powerful companies that we're talking about in this motion oftentimes have the best lawyers in the world who can make very compelling legal arguments on technicalities. This looks like arguments on the words like knowledge in the definition, where given that the ICC only has jurisdiction over natural persons and not corporations, the chains of command inherent in companies means that it's very easy for people to deny responsibility in terms of denying that you had knowledge over whether or not something would cause widespread environmental harm. Secondly, on the substantial likelihood threshold in the definition, this is higher than the reasonable foreseeability threshold in tort, and it means that it's impossible for accidents like oil spills to be prosecuted, because you can never prove that there was a substantial likelihood of environmental harm. Thirdly, on the definition of wanton, and here's where I want to talk about their response, where they say that we're not banning factories. The problem here is that it's highly vague what ecocide actually is, right? For example, the Stop Ecocide website itself encompasses things like agriculture, mining, and industrial emissions as things that qualify as ecocide. This means here that any proportionality assessment that we can make is incredibly difficult to make because you need to balance environmental issues against economic interests, and there's no clear metric to do so. Let's assume charitably then that we take an environmentalist view. This means that oftentimes we will set an unfairly high standard on things like inefficient manufacturing processes in the developing world. We tell people that they could do better and therefore it's disproportionate. Or on things like industrial agriculture, where even though it's very necessary for some countries' economies, we view it as something that is disproportionate. Then I want to address their case about the IHL and its use in wartime. A new problem arises here where countries are actually unlikely to uphold principles while trying to win wars. For example, Russia is a party to the Geneva Convention, yet it's raining bombs on Ukrainian cities and torturing prisoners of war. The point here is that principles tend to disappear in wartime, and this will likely be more so the case when these principles concern ecosystems and indeterminate future harms rather than human victims with lives and with stories. The conclusion here is that it's very difficult to enforce ecocide. But let's talk about their broader case, which is about principles. So they say that we create a broader principle in international law against environmental crimes. The issue here is threefold. Firstly, that there's already a norm against ecocide. Climate movements around the world exist. There are widespread climate disasters that people are aware of. There's a consensus around most people that there is a problem surrounding the climate. We do not need the ICC, for example, to tell us that genocide was horrible. The ICC builds on norms that already exist within the international community rather than creating those norms itself. Secondly, any deterrent effect that they might want to talk about principally is cancelled out if there are poor enforcement mechanisms. The reason for this is that perpetrators will assume that they will not be caught if they commit environmental crimes, and they won't be stopped by principle alone. The ICC is viewed by many, as Heather explained, as a fossilized institution with limited effectiveness and credibility, and this declaration that ecocide is an environmental crime will not carry very much weight. Finally, this may actually serve to trivialize ecocide, because when it's no longer something that is purely a moral norm, but something that we fruitlessly try to prosecute, but cannot in most cases, it only adds more fuel to the rhetorical fire for people who believe that climate action is futile. Therefore, there might actually be a harm there. Let's then talk about international cooperation. The premise here is that the ICC already has a reputation of being prejudiced, where it was established, is run, and is founded almost entirely by Western powers. But moreover, 47 of the 50 people it's indicted have been black or Arab, where countries like Burundi have already left the ICC citing racism. South Africa and Gambia have tried to do the same, and the entire African Union proposed a resolution to leave. The discontent with the ICC already exists. Here's why it gets worse. It's because it feels hypocritical for countries like the US and those in Europe, who had hundreds of years to develop before you and harm the environment with impunity, to then turn around and try to prosecute you for developing in a similar way. Where the reasons that your crops are drowned out in a monsoon is not because of something that you did in history, but because of fracking and cars and factories in a richer land thousands of miles away. Where the reason that you can't go outside in the sweltering heat is the decades of what you perceive as unjust enrichment at your expense. And now the ICC is going after your country because it can't go after the US or China or India, and your mining industry you feel is becoming equated with the worst crimes against humanity, like genocide. We don't feel that's equivalent on principle. The harms then, firstly, is that this is going to further undermine both IHL and ICL, because it will undermine the ICC's credibility to set norms. We could very well see much of the developing world following in the way of Burundi and leaving the ICC. But furthermore, this will undo a lot of climate change cooperation. This looks like binding agreements like the Paris Agreement or COP summits. These are delicate arrangements that are hinged on careful negotiation because you have to coordinate a million small interests. This only happens with mutual goodwill. But when we poison the well of discourse with resentment, countries pull out, and they develop animosity towards each other and towards Western institutions. Because these agreements are built on global cooperation, no one joins these agreements if some people pull out, because they feel like some countries are benefiting but not contributing to these agreements to an equal extent. So at the end of the day, diplomacy is inherently an uphill battle that we cannot fight with fire. The more roadblocks that we create that appear to be against countries' best interests, the more antagonistic they become. In the government's best case, they get a few prosecutions of environmental damage, but we get change that applies to far more countries rather than just those in the jurisdiction of the ICC, but also our agreements are proactive and create obligations for countries rather than retroactive and chasing countries 5 years after they commit environmental crimes. Very proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 2 seconds. I now call upon the government whip. Madam Speaker, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Yes. Give me 30 seconds before you start, please.
Madam Speaker, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Thank you. This debate boils down to 3 primary questions, right? 1, is it principally all right? Is it logically sound for us to include ecocide within IHL? Number 2, is there a possibility for accountability within this ecosystem of international law? And thirdly, can their paradigm of cooperation internationally and working together for the environment exist on both sides or only on theirs, right? First of all, 250 million people in Africa are transhuman, for example. They travel across the continent for agriculture, for rearing their animals. They are essentially migrants, right? They don't settle in one position. Now, due to immense and urgent climate crisis, their resources, their water, their rearing areas, all of these things are ceasing to exist, right? In that sense, 250 people 250 million people across Africa who are transhuman, constantly migrating, are now going to be engaging in armed conflict because of lack of resources and fight over them, right? We think cutting-edge research across the world by professionals everywhere are telling us that 3 to 20% increase in armed conflict is due to immense and urgent climate change, right? In that regard, principally speaking, everything that the IHL kind of dictates on in terms of the impacts of armed conflict and how that affects human beings, those impacts are the same, if not meaningfully akin to armed conflicts, and therefore it principally makes sense for us to include this issue within the IHL, right? So in terms of impact, in terms of logic, in terms of principle, the impacts of ecocide and the kind of harm it might cause and the essentiality of ruling on it today so that we don't have like thousands of armed conflicts across the world for people fighting over water, food, and like resources is essential to do today, right? A principle they haven't really engaged with, because this house supports ecocide as a principle to be included within IHL, logically and principally makes sense in terms of its impacts on the world and the number of people who are currently engaging in armed conflict and will continue to do so in terms of its impact that we see in wars and in hot wars across the world, right? That is an unengaged with principle. We think we kind of have that, right? But in terms of accountability, they give you a bunch of issues with why the ICC is not going to work out. We tell you that which they agree to, is that climate change is a global problem, and we think we need global solutions for it. The reason we can't hold corporations accountable is because they're headquartered across the world, and they go and do their activities which are violent in nature, which are ecocidal in nature, in places that they can't be held accountable, right? The only way you can potentially do that is when you have an overarching kind of principle, an overarching institution that rules on things which are overarching in nature, which are applicable across the world to go ahead and hold people accountable in places that they're potentially headquartered. Right? In that sense, the possibility of corporations which are global in nature, who go ahead and commit ecocidal activities in areas which are like developing or are harmed the most or are the most vulnerable, is far more on our side when we have an international overarching system where they can be indeed held accountable, right? However, they say that, listen, it's like people will claim that they didn't have knowledge, right? Sure, the definition says that you need to have knowledgeably done wanton acts which have long-term impact, etc. However, the way that ICC functions or that courts across the world function in this regard are fault-based, not intent-based, right? In that sense, when you go ahead and tell me that a huge corporation or a big state has allowed corporations to come in with bad labor laws, with bad environmental laws, and these guys can't be held accountable because hey, they didn't have the knowledge of how bad this could potentially be for the world, that's not really fair because their intent is not important in these rulings in these jurisdictions. What's important is it being fault-based. A fault has been committed, an ecocide has been committed, people have been harmed, akin to the harm of armed conflict, and therefore there's potential of that happening on our side, right? We also reject the idea of the ICC and the ICJ being fossilized institutions who can't do anything, right? We think since the Nuremberg trials in the 1940s, them happening is why we have the word genocide in our vocabulary, in our law, in our consciousness, right? Sure, genocide happen, wars happen, people get killed all the time. It's harmful, it's painful. But the fact that the term genocide exists in our consciousness, in law, in rhetoric, is because in the 1940s, the Nuremberg trial happened to include this in international law, right? So what we have argued to you essentially is that we rather we have a law, rather we have a principle, rather we have a concept that we can kind of cling on to claim our rights and move courts around it than have nothing at all because it might not work out, right? We think there's potential and there's principled basis for this to be argued for. Cooperation, right? The COP26-27, whichever happened more recently, has now revolutionarily agreed for a developing countries fund, right? Which means that for the first time in history, they have agreed that the worst sufferers of climate change are in fact not the worst contributors. In that the developing countries in fact now owe developed countries now owe reparations to developing nations who they have hurt, right? So COP27-26, that fund, that unique revolutionary fund that acknowledges the harms and the damages done by developed nations, which significantly and disproportionately hurt developing nations, exists, right? Under Agenda 21 of the United Nations, common but differentiated responsibility also exists. Those things exist. It's a benefit which is mutually inexclusive, right? They haven't really painted to you why suddenly, because we have an ecocide law, which they think will be utterly insufficient and won't punish anyone at all, will now lead to such a disbalance that we will not have COP26-27, we will not have Agenda 21 at all, which actually goes ahead and recognizes recognizes the balance of power across the world and holds people accountable, right? They can't argue to you in one breath that, hey, nobody gets punished, nothing ever happens, it's an utterly racist institution that doesn't really care about people who are actually the most vulnerable, and also argue, hey, it's going to have such a great impact that all international cooperation will cease to exist. We think that it's going to be difficult to implement this. We think this law will be difficult to actually be, quote-unquote, effective. We think it will be difficult to prosecute people who need to be prosecuted. We give them that. But what we also don't take from them is that the ICC or the ICJ is an essentially fossilized body that can't do anything at all. The moment you go ahead and add the idea of ecocide to the rhetoric of, say, genocide, the rhetoric of crimes against humanity, the rhetoric of war crimes, is when you have a real potential to change mentalities. Sure, the law might not automatically work tomorrow. It will take some time. But we think this gestational period the law will take to actually be effective is, in fact, very, very important in our side of the House, because this allows for corporations, allows for states, allows for all big mechanisms that have to make changes meaningfully, say corporations having to change their business practices and production practices, or countries having to go ahead and change laws, etc., to comply with ecocide laws. They need that gestational period to actually implement those things. So we think if things take time, that's actually a good thing, because it's a direction that they have to take, and that direction takes time to actually implement. We take that. But we also think that the moment you add the idea of ecocide being connected to or similar to war crimes, connected to or similar to crimes against humanity, connected or similar to genocide, arbitrated by institutions like the ICC or like the ICJ, which deal on these things, no matter how many people they end up punishing. The rhetoric is that insurers, companies, people who sell us things don't want to be associated with war criminals, right? The potential of this rhetoric actually pushing through public consciousness, actually changing our consumer behaviors, actually changing anything to do with the corporate bureaucracy that both sides complain about, is far more on our side, because finally there's an incentive to invest in green energy, to invest in processes which might be expensive, to actually overcome the inertia of doing something, quote unquote, for the environment, because now you don't want to be associated and have the danger to for insurers backing out by saying, hey, your work is potentially war crime. Your work is potentially ecocide. It could be compared to genocide. The ICC and the ICJ arbitrate on this, right? The potential of that to actually penetrate any consciousness is far more on our side, right? With that, the possibility of accountability, a principled sort of logic that is sound and falls within the ambit of the IHL, we are very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I now call upon the final debate speech by the Whip of Opposition. So you have the floor for 8 minutes.
1 second, please.
So you have the floor for 8 minutes.
We're being told that environmental rights are human rights. And this is nice rhetoric, but at the end of the day, rights only matter when they are realized. When I am dying because my crops wither under scorching heat, then I do not care about high-minded rhetoric. These ideals are the luxury of those who are not primarily affected by the actual dangers of climate change. I think this debate, therefore, is then about who actually helps the world, who realizes the rights, who doesn't just say them, but causes change on the ground for the people who need it most. Let's engage with what government has told us here. And what they tell us consistently throughout their speeches is that we need to hold global corporations accountable, that Shell dodges all these different domestic laws, and we need an institution that stands up to them at the highest level. And the question I have is, but how? How does the ICC manage to do this? How do they manage to actually enforce these laws? Which policeman is going to drag the Shell CEO into The Hague? The US, as a good example, is not a member, not a signer of the ICC. If by like some miracle, you get this law passed, the CEOs would simply relocate to the US and you would have zero legal accountability. You could not reach them anymore. And then they tell us is, oh, all of our concerns around enforceability, around actually ensuring that people can't hide their accountability through the many layers of obfuscating middle management. This wouldn't happen, because surely we would use a fault-based system. And I would like that too, but we're debating a specific motion with a specific definition, and lawyers of all people are very annoying about specific definitions, and I think they would stick to them quite clearly. But even then, suppose we grant them this, and we're charitable. This still doesn't solve your enforcement question. If you like the ICC so much, then, think of one example of a person, a high-ranking official, that has actually been tried and found guilty by the ICC. One single instance of injustice where the ICC meaningfully made the world better. And I can't think of one of those. Many of you in the audience probably can't as well, because this institution is sclerotic, it is unhelpful, and it has outlived its welcome in many of the ways. Yes. Okay. Cool. Now, I hate to be a little annoying about the definitions in this motion and what ecocide might mean. But ultimately, I think this is a fundamental problem that is inherent in the concept and not something that I'm just being annoying about. If you look at one of the premier advocacy organizations for ecocide, Stop Ecocide UK, the examples that they list as ecocide on their website are A, large-scale agriculture, B, cattle farming, C, soybean farming, D, all forms of mining, industrial emissions, and cement production. In short, if they got their wish and all of this was declared a crime against nature, industrial society, like current Western living standards, would simply cease to exist. Now, this is clearly unworkable, and this is clearly not something that would realistically happen in the world. But the problem is, then how do you adjust the definition? How do you manage to craft a conception of ecocide that includes the worst excesses, but excludes all the stuff that we don't think we can reasonably legislate out of existence because there is simply no democratic mandate for it? The problem here is the severity of actions is mostly a function of scale. One high-intensity agricultural farm isn't a problem. The problem is that it happens all over the globe. But then the question is, which of these farms do you outlaw? Which of them do you drag to The Hague and tell them that they have to stop? These are decisions you have to make. And every single option you can pick is going to reek of hypocrisy. Every single option begs the question of why you didn't choose the 1,000 other options. And this is where we get to the problem that this legislation entailed. When government rightly tells us is, okay, so this law has little enforceability at all, so why is it bad? Why do we care at all? Here's why we care. Because some cases you will get to the ICC, but there are the worst kind of cases. These are the cases of countries so powerless and so poor that they can be effectively pressured into actually extraditing their citizens, something that Canada or Germany would never do. These are the cases in which organizations are so small and so lean that you can actually prove intent, that you can actually prove knowledge. What this means is these are the cases of a Brazilian subsistence farmer deforesting the Amazon out of sheer survival. And the problem is now, this seems quite hypocritical. This again is the West imposing its vision of an environmental legislation on the rest of the world, taking its legislative wrath out on those who are the least powerful and the least deserving. And what's the problem now? This means we have to convince the whole global South, countries which did very little to contribute to climate change, but will be an integral part of the solution to climate change. We have to convince them to sign on to further legislation, onto the next iteration of the Paris Agreement. But we do it in the same breath in which the preeminent institution of justice in this world prosecutes only them and not us, prosecutes their crimes and not our crimes, when the thing they've been telling us for decades at this point is that there is a problem with climate justice. This is the hypocrisy that we talk about. This is the thorn in the side of international discourse that government buys itself. And why is this a problem? Because climate diplomacy is difficult. Diplomacy at the best of times is an incredibly intricate and delicate process. Imagine for a second that you're a negotiator at a COP conference. You have to wrangle hundreds of other countries with disparate interests and lots of different specific agenda items and negotiation objectives into one cohesive legal text. You have to do that in about half a week under severe stress, under sleep deprivation, under your own government that sets you new objectives every single day. Countries in this arena of international negotiation are already necessarily risk-averse. They're necessarily cautious because they don't want to lightheartedly take on commitments that they will not be able to keep in the future. So now, if you introduce an undercurrent of distrust and enmity, you throw a massive wrench into this process. It means that every time the US approaches a sub-Saharan African country, the first question they will ask is, what new way has the US found to trick us this time? And I think this is the kind of atmosphere in which cooperation will not happen. This is the kind of atmosphere in which the few progresses that we have made will be undone and ultimately spell not doom for the planet, but certainly a far worse world. We think that there is actually hope. We think the trajectory right now isn't all that bad. Think about the Paris Agreement, an actual international agreement. Think about the massive cost reductions of solar and wind power. Think about the global waves of youth protest. We think climate change can and will be solved in time, but only if we do it together and not with the West, again, imposing its vision on the rest of the world.
Thank you, sir. The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 1 second. Now I give both the teams 3 minutes to consolidate and create draft their reply speeches. I call this House back into order. Both teams will be now allowed to give one reply speech for 4 minutes. I now call upon team opposition to send the reply speaker. Madam Speaker, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
Firstly, I will address side government's principle, then I'll talk about the efficacy of enforcement, finally I'll talk about international cooperation. On the principle, it is simply not enough for government to try to win on the principle, because as we stated, there are lots of principles that we can agree with, but do not necessarily enforce through international humanitarian law. Things like the right to education or to political expression, things that are all human rights, and that we generally think are good, but are not enforced through international legal mechanisms. They never explained why something like mining in the Congo is equivalent to genocide, and that link would have been necessary to win them the debate. Secondly, on efficacy, we've given a lot of reasons, none of which were adequately refuted by the government team, on jurisdiction, on capacity of the ICC, on extradition difficulties, on definitional uncertainties, that necessarily mean that the world's richest corporations and largest polluters can continue to pollute with impunity. Furthermore, if side government is going to stress the urgency of climate change, as they've done throughout their entire bench, it's a bit confusing that they go for the solution that often takes 10 years to get someone into court and to run the whole case through. We've established that, sure, some cases will be prosecuted, not all cases will be prosecuted, but this is simply not enough for the principled credibility that the ICC needs to get any of their real benefits. It's not enough to create any real deterrent effect for potential polluters, and it's not enough to make any realistic dent in emissions if climate change is anywhere near as bad as side government says it is, given that nearly 70% of the world's emissions are not within the jurisdiction of the ICC. Given that, let's talk about our positive case on cooperation. So what does actually matter here is the cases in which, the cases that we do end up trying to enforce are those in the developing world where pollution is oftentimes part of industrialization. So in Sam's speech, he gave a bunch of examples of things that are actually advocated for by the Stop Ecocide International organization, things like industrial mining, things like agriculture, that would all fall under the umbrella of this debate to some extent. Given that we cannot do anything to the largest polluters, it's not a contradiction to say that we would go after cases that are, like, principally worse to go after instead. So even if we don't actually prosecute all cases, the perception of this inequality is enough. We've explained here, to no response, that the ICC is an institution that many countries have already tried to leave on accusations of being racist. So for example, when you're Nigeria and the ICC starts coming after your oil industry, accusing it of being ecocide, you question why now ecocide has become a crime when the West had a 200-year head start over you to pollute the earth with impunity. Here's why we care, and they haven't taken this down, that firstly, this undercuts the ICC's legitimacy more. So if Proposition cared a lot in this debate about human rights and enforcing them, presumably they would disagree if more countries would leave the ICC. But we say that countries are going to follow in the Gambia's footsteps when there starts being accusations of racism. But secondly, you poison the waters of international cooperation with a law system that reeks of hypocrisy, because diplomacy is delicate and it can be broken by the smallest of things. And when you are trying to get a country in the global south to sign on to the next COP agreement, that country is going to say, haven't you already done enough? Isn't the ICC already doing enough for me? This undermines the foundations of trust and cooperation that are the way forward. Sam explained in his speech that we've already made strides in climate progress and we can continue to do so in the future. But in order to continue this progress, we need to build each other up, not tear the delicate bridges apart that we've tried for decades to build. The difference then is that while they might prosecute individuals, in limited cases, we get proactive solutions that set targets for countries, like the Paris Accords, that they can build towards in the future, but also we're able to build solutions that target all countries equally, that don't just leave behind the global south at the expense of protecting Western powers. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the last speech for this debate, I now call upon the reply speaker from side proposition. Madam Speaker, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
So the opposition has laudably emphasized the lack of enforceability, the racism of the ICC, the inequality of halting the development of developing nations while developed nations are emitting the worst emissions. But what standards are the opposition exactly advocating for? Development for the sake of development. The UK, China, and the US, which they mentioned during their industrial revolution, had cases of child abuse violations, alarming wages, and human rights abuse. What exactly are the opposition advocating for? A return to those standards? The proposition has constructed a deficiency argument, emphasizing the failings of the current system without engaging with the process enacted by these very systems. It's very easy to stand on a podium and mention all the bad things wrong with the system without actually engaging with the progress that can be made with it. It is easier to do this. We have actually provided a need for the law in IHL, shown why the enactment in IHL makes principled and logical sense. And when states cannot prosecute ecocide, they are on the international stage and they have the mechanisms that the ICC and ICJ has. They have advocated for global diplomacy, a concept that already exists in our world. What are their actual original contributions, mechanisms, and methods? Global diplomacy doesn't have to be devoid of the ICC and the ICJ, which they would make you believe. Would they prefer a world where there is no ICC or ICJ, where genocide is actually legal? I would like for them to actually address this. And we believe that some justice is actually better than no justice, when some standards are upheld, rather than when no standards are upheld at all. When facing a crisis with compounding harms, no success is marginal. In their best case, which is climate diplomacy, that already exists, the president of Maldives himself was asking for the enactment of the ecocidal law in IHL. So in their world, where this law already exists, the person is asking for our solution. What exactly are they going to say in order to solve this? Any critique they have made of the ICC is a symptom of an existing society. Can they actually say that the ICC and the ICJ are the enactors of racism? They are experiencing symptoms of the world that we live in. Rather than mentioning and potholing and mentioning limitations, we are trying to engage in a world that actually sees these problems and enacts solutions, rather than standing on the podium and highlighting these problems. We tell you that through our mechanisms, small developing countries will have more negotiating power. They have nitpicked, they have mischaracterized. What have they practically contributed? Our motion defends human rights, places a protection on individuals, and provides mechanism. It is easy to fall victim to pessimism and environmental burnout, but what our side actually contributes is a mechanism to put this into place. We keep on, and as we said before, there should not be a distinction between humanitarian rights and environmental rights. And I didn't just say that because I like how it sounded. I said it because I thought it was actually a legitimate idea, as corroborated by my speakers on my side. We want to defend human rights, place the protection of the environment in terms of the individuals who are most affected, and provide a mechanism. We are still waiting for their legitimate contribution and mechanisms that don't already exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With that, we are now at the end of the debate phase of the event. We will now take a 5-minute recess, and the jury will retire to Solomon Davis to deliberate the debate. We have an exciting panel, meanwhile, organized for you, which we'll introduce them after the recess. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. I hope everyone has found their way back to their seats. So hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I work at the British Embassy in Bern, and I have the huge pleasure to introduce two guests who are joining me on stage today while we wait for the jury to decide on who shall win this debate. And I think we can all really agree that that was intense and impressive and absolutely incredible. So once again, well done to all the debaters. Yeah. So next to me, I have our two guests. For one, here I am joined by Christina Meissner. She is the vice president of the Biopark here in Geneva and also a local politician. Yes. And on my right-hand side is Dr. Tobias Blaha, who is the director of the Biopark here in Geneva. And thank you so much to both of you for being here today. We've heard so much about ecocide, about legal frameworks, and now I'd really like to hear from both of you. How does this whole issue impact us here in Geneva, here in Switzerland? What have your experiences been? And yeah, just really rounding this whole thing off. And before we do that, I think it's quite useful if both of you would introduce yourselves. And especially one thing that I'd be really interested to know is what brought you guys to the Biopark and what made you dedicate your work to the protection of the natural world?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for inviting us. Thanks to everyone to being there, interested by such an important subject like ecocide. And well, I guess everybody has to go back to his emotions when he was small, and that's my case. I've always been close to nature, and then I started as a volunteer in local organizations, and then I was lucky enough to be able to combine my interest in nature with a job, and I started in an NGO which is local, maybe some you know, is the biggest NGO in Switzerland for nature protection, is Pro Natura, and I started the local office of Pro Natura in 1990. That's a long time ago. But I would say that even before that, I always wanted to save animals, and I started in another NGO, which is local, with CITES in Fondation France Weber, trying to save elephants in such big organization and meetings, trying to put, these elephants in the protected endangered species annex. And slowly but surely, I started becoming more and more locally interested to things because, think global, act local, that's definitely something that happens to all of us. You think, okay, I want to save the world, but what can I do really at my level? So I did these 10 years in saving nature reserves and doing all I could for the local Swiss and Geneva nature. Then I worked for 10 years for the government, using my knowledge and my network as a communication officer for the Conseiller d'État, which is our local ministers. And then after 10 years of writing his speeches, I thought, well, maybe I can write my own speeches. And I started in politics. And it's 14 years that I've been in the Geneva Parliament. But be it in the associative world, personally, I do have also a hedgehog rescue center. And of course, professionally, and then politically, there was always one aim for me, is try to do my best to save nature. And of course, maybe with not so much ambition as the world, but at least if I can do my part locally, that will be already fine. That's it.
Thanks so much, Christina. Yeah, I really like your reference to think global, act local. That was actually what my master's thesis was kind of about a little bit. So very interesting. And your love for nature, it really shines through when you speak. Thank you so much. And I guess also that love for nature and love for animals particularly is something that you share very much with Christina and Tobias.
Yes, absolutely. I would also start in my childhood. So even before I was born, my parents had like a little farm with goats and sheep and donkeys and so on. And this is the world I was born in. And I was always close to nature. So after school, I jumped into the rivers, catched fish with my hands and so on. Also at school, it was always difficult with my teachers as well. When we went for a walk outside, I catch the snake and I said, yes, nice to be us, but please bring it back. It was really like, I was really interested in nature and in animals from really the first days on. The big question was always what to do with this interest and with this love. So I decided to study veterinary medicine because it was also like animal protection I was always interested in. And I made several internships in international zoological institutions as well. And I was mostly interested in the conservation work, reproducing animals ex situ, also in situ programs, supporting countries where the natural habitats of the animals are. And therefore, I specialized myself more and more in the direction of zoological institutions. So with 25 and a half years, I became the director of the zoo of Lucerne in the German part of Switzerland, and it was exactly not a zoological institution I wanted to work in. So it was like more like a leisure park where people just came to watch animals and being like in a double passivity role. So the first role is like watching animals in their enclosures, and then the second time like watching on the global level how biodiversity is disappearing without taking any action. I started to try to implement educational programs, conservation programs, but it was not wanted from the government there. So I decided to leave there and finally ended up here in Geneva without speaking any single word in French. So it was really complicated for me at the beginning. We had a kakadu in our park who spoke better French than me. That was quite funny, and this is how it started. And it's really great that Christina is here too. She is really our angel of the biopark, and we can see on a daily basis how important it is also to have political support and a person who knows about how the government is functioning, how are the laws, and how here a special canton is functioning. So the Genferei, what people say about Geneva, it's really the truth. It's something, a special word here.
Thanks so much, Tobias. Yeah, you two seem to make a great team. You have the scientist, the vet here on one side, and
I'm a biologist
yes,
too, as
of
formation,
course,
and I did that in South America in the Amazonian forest. So no, I do have some field knowledge too.
Touché. Apologies. But yes, what I meant to say was, and you of course also feed into this, is that you really have this nexus between policy and science, which is of course something really important. What have you done at Biopark or in general where you have really, what kind of projects have you been working on that explore this nexus and that work towards conservation, for example, here in Geneva? And how have you roped in the wider society into this?
Tobias, it's your world. Talk about it.
Perfect. Yeah, so it was the former Parc Jalonde, an animal refuge, which was a bit like not up to date, let's say it carefully, and it needed some consulting. So the thing was like to start something completely new, the idea, and we started with our 5 missions finally. It's first of all continuing with the refuge part, because we signed a convention with CITES on the federal level, which means like CITES is the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species, Flora and Fauna, and we are welcoming confiscated animals. Also important animals are coming to our park, or like animals which are confiscated from the authorities, the governmental veterinarians. And the second thing is like conservation. So we work here in Geneva for conservation projects. We have a care center with also hedgehogs. Thanks to Christina, we work hand in hand. Squirrels and dormice, etc. So these animals, when they are injured and so on, the Geneva population has the opportunity to bring these animals to our park. And as I'm a vet, we try to heal them, and the majority can be released, which is really, really great. Also, there's like the bald ibis. I don't know if you know this bird. It's a really funny one, a big one with a long beak. And they're endangered. It's a migrating bird, and they're coming back now to Switzerland after huge efforts. It was like done with 3 countries together. It was like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And the responsibility of the species in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, it's in the biopark. There's also the European pond turtles, so almost no one knows that also in Switzerland there's white turtles existing. We are keeping them in our biopark. We have an existing population in the wild as well. We are communicating about them. We have educational programs, and there's also like a releasing program here in Geneva. Our third mission is education, because conservation absolutely does not work without education. You can imagine we have children coming to our park who don't know the difference between a goat and a sheep, and biodiversity, and also we heard a lot about climate change. These topics are so complex and not easy to understand, so we have to start on a little lower level then before we start with the more complex topics. And therefore, we have special educational programs. Also, Nelly, our educational responsible, is here today. She's making special guided tours, visits, and we had just in June last year over 90 school classes coming to our park. And we really tried to bring them closer to nature, to animals, and to create emotions and empathy. Therefore, I come already to the next topic, which is research. Because we need to have knowledge. The more we know about animals, the more we know about species, the more we know about ecosystems, the more we can do for them. And therefore, we started several different research projects. One was the first morphological description of crocodile species. So you might think we are now in Geneva, how it's possible. But in 2009, there was like the Nile crocodile. Maybe every one of you knows this species, a huge crocodile, which was always seen as one species. But in 2009, Dr. Andreas Schmidt, who also works in Geneva, found out that there's two different species, basically. So genetically, they're really not related to each other. And we are talking about an adult size of more than 4.5 meters, but no one knows how a really West African desert crocodile, which was the second species now coming out of this, looks like. And this was the job of Nelly as well. So it was something we did in collaboration also with the IUCN Crocodile Specialist Group of the United Nations. We have also a really interesting research project, which is really important also for the topic we all discussed. We had talked about emotions, about feelings, and so on. So our big question for this research I'm talking now about is how to make people act for biodiversity. And therefore we start with Professor Tobias Brosch, who is an environmental psychologist, head of the Department of Psychology of the University of Geneva, a research program. So more than 311 people were asked in the entrance how they feel, what brought them to come to the biopark, and also afterwards, what were their experiences, what did they feel, and if they are able now to do something for biodiversity, if they learn something, like just their progress. And I'm not allowed to talk about all the details now, but what I can tell you, the results were really incredible. Because we have these special guided tours or like interactions with animals when we have walk-through enclosures and so on. It was really amazing how these animals really touch in a double sense. So when they touch the people, but also emotionally. And there's a psychological tool which can be used in a mathematical way, which quantitative proved now that direct hands-on contact, the first hands-on experience with animals and drastically brings people to nature conservation and opens like their heart and creates empathy and makes it more specific for them to act for biodiversity. Exactly, so the research part is really, really important. And then last but not least, or almost, so we have also in sector culture. So on the federal level, we are part of the Federal Foundation of Museums of Switzerland, and we are created in this topic too. And now really the last one is like we have animal-assisted intervention programs, which means that the park is accessible for everyone, and we have programs for handicapped people, especially autists and so on, where they have special interactions with animals and which also brings them to, or like helps them to be more independent and to progress in their difficulties.
If you may allow me just to say one thing. Out of the 300 animals that we have in the biopark, most 90% have not chosen their fate. They are from illegal detention, abandoned, traffic, which is also illegal. And well, what do we do with these animals? We get them, we don't choose to get them, we try to rescue them, we try to give them a better life, the closest to what they are supposed to have as a species, and then we say, well, could they be of help to us too? And that's where we do this animal-assisted intervention, because there's a way to do good on both sides. The humans are feeling better thanks to the emotions, thanks to the fact that animals don't judge, and the animals, most of them are used to seeing the human being, so they come to have also a profit of being with the human being. So it's a win-win situation. We try to take the best of a situation that in the beginning is not good. That is illegal detention of animals.
Thank you so much. Yeah, what you're saying about interacting with animals, that it could be really powerful to people, the way it touches them physically and emotionally, is something that I've also experienced myself and completely agree with.
Most welcome, anytime.
Thank you, as is everyone else here, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about challenges, and you mentioned illegal trade, for example, what, in the biopark or more generally, what do you think are important tools to counter that? Or is there too long a list for that question?
Well, you know, unfortunately, I wish that this world was perfect, but it's not. And, well, we are the example at the biopark of taking animals that have been abandoned, that have not chosen their fate, and we do not have the power on the biopark level of influencing the law or anything. We just try to do our best to make a world better for these animals and for the human beings that are visiting these animals for one reason or another. Then, I mean, if you ask me as a politician, I would say that, and I was very, very interested by the debate today, because I don't work on such a very high level usually. I mean, I'm on the local level. But it's very, very difficult when you see that people have difficulties to access already to the law, to denounce things, to know at which level to denounce. And then you have three powers, and these three powers, I mean, you know, there's the legal system that, I mean, the législatif, as we call it in French, that is the parliament that makes laws. And then you have to question who is in the parliament, who makes these laws, and I must admit that it's full of lobbies. And then when you come to the justice, the other power, the justice, do we give the justice the means to act? Do they have the means? I mean, the people, the money to do their job? And then you have, of course, the executive, the government. Are they free? Do they have the power? Do they have the means? Do they have enough police to run after somebody? And then when you see that the fines that they get are so low, so they're not dissuasive at all. And that's the problem. I mean, we talk about animals that we have in the park, and when you know how ridiculous the fines are, everybody's going to try to risk it. I mean, and it's the same on the international level. You have to ask ourselves, it's nice to have laws, but you have to have the means to implement it and to make sure that you can repair or make sure that it never happens again. And that's where it becomes really, really very difficult. And I think that every generation that passes, you have to give the lesson again and again of what is nature, how important it is to our lives. And this is an ongoing job. It's going to be your job also. I've done my part. I'm still doing it. But it's the most difficult thing is to think that the war is never won. You have to all the time remind people that without nature, we're nothing. This is, we are animals like any other, and we need this nature. But the problem is that we don't give us, it doesn't give a slap in our faces immediately. It's something that, well, maybe, yes, COVID is maybe it's a case for ecocide, let's face it, because it comes out of deforestation. I mean, we could all file but to whom, a case against this COVID that we all was subjected to. But I was really quite stunned by the fact that we are fighting since 50 years already. Everybody knows since the 70s about the problems that we're doing to this planet. And there, for the first time in my life, I've seen the whole world being able to act, to implement things, to put the money, to put the power, to put everything to solve the problems. Now, what are we waiting to do this? Are we waiting for a second COVID?
I hope not. Yeah, you brought up just some, huge challenges, and thank you for the reminder that it is up to us now to try and solve this problem. It's not an easy one. It's hard to stay motivated. So maybe before we go to see who won this debate today, the debate is ongoing on how we can solve this whole situation. How do we stay motivated? How do you stay motivated? What message can you bring our audience here?
I cannot imagine my life on this planet without trying to do my part. That's all.
For me, it's still a story. I don't know if you know the story about the little girl with this starfish. There was like a big storm, and thousands of starfish were on the coast. And the little girl just started in the early morning hours to throw them back into the water. And there was an older person coming and spoke to her and said, what you're doing there, there's absolutely no sense behind that. You never ever will solve them. You won't make a difference. And she takes one and shows them and says, for this one, it makes a difference, and throw him back in the water. And this is exactly the philosophy. I'm waking up every morning and trying to do something. For sure, we won't solve all the problems. We won't save all the animals. But every day we do a little bit. And this is also what is like the basic message. So every day a little action can make a difference. And the thing here in the biopark, also from the completely team and what we do every day, it's like everyone can do something and everyone is going to do something here. And this can make the difference. So this is the motivation for us, the team.
So you have the choice now between the hummingbird, Rabi, the hummingbird, I do my part, and the starfish.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I think the debate is never ending, like I said, but for now.
It just appeared now behind, and you're going to say that we've been talking about deforestation and catastrophic things. I told you I had a rescue center for hedgehogs. Sorry for some pictures that are a bit hard, but you'll see the situation becomes better afterwards. It's the same hedgehog all the time. What happened to this hedgehog is just simple. Weed whacker, fire in the garden, that's what happens. We're all responsible of a little ecocide in our backyard. That's what I wanted to say, but then what you do at your local level, in your backyard, helps also on a much higher level. Everything is linked. So think about this next time you go in your backyard. And don't say, not in my backyard.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think we'll leave that as the final word. And I'll probably use these images behind us because just before there was a picture up of the healing process. Because, of course, not everything is lost. We still have power to make right. And with that, I will hand back over to find out who won.
Thank you very much. Good luck to you both.
Right. So now we're entering the final phase. I would like to now invite the jury onto the stage to sort of discuss and unpack the debate, after which we'll declare the awards. Right. So I think we'll keep this short. Won't take too much time with this. So Greg, actually, why don't you tell us what you thought about the debate?
Many thanks, Ryan, and thanks to the British Embassy and to the Graduate Institute for the invitation. It was very impressive. I have to admit, it was the first this style of debate I observed. I've done a couple of moot courts and similar competitions. It was very impressive to see the interactions and the presentations of both teams. Maybe this will sound a bit German lawyer style, but I did from time to time lack a bit of legal analysis. Or let's say the legal analysis was not as clear as my professors would have wanted it to be back in law school. And I think there is merit to really go through a very structured legal analysis to make the specific point that you're making, not only as a matter of, because lawyers like to hear about law, but also specifically as a matter of a structured legal analysis makes your argument more convincing. But again, they were excellent arguments both on legal and policy side that very impressed me. And maybe one more thing that I would like to add is that I would have wished sometimes for a little bit more responsiveness to the individual candidates. So picking up points and really going through them and explaining that I will address this point now in response. And this is why I think while the House or the opposition's side did not make a strong argument in that, and this is why I think my argument is better. Those would be my 2 cents.
Fair enough. Nicole?
I echo what Greg just said. It's really great to see all the preparation and the hard work that went into preparing for your arguments. Of course, coming from the ICRC, I would have hoped for a bit more sounder legal analysis. And again, as Greg said, a preparation and explanation what the legal reasoning is all. You all jumped into the arguments pretty quickly. Also from my background in communications, I would have hoped for a lesser pace, a slower argumentation, just to pause from time to time, to allow listeners to understand, reflect, and let it sink in. It was like a race. You were just like racing through the debate. In terms of public communication, lesser pace would be good. I was also struck by the disillusion and the lack of trust in international law and international justice, I guess. I studied at the Graduate Institute 20 years ago, at the time when the Rome Statute came into force and the International Criminal Court. So I think I was of a generation which had more trust and hope for international justice, as probably you have today. But I'm moving away from your question.
That's all right. Dim, what did you think? Did the debaters engage with each other enough?
Before I say that, in terms of who should go to the ICC, whoever decided that we should do this before telling them who won, I think that you guys have a case to make against Ryan personally, and there are lawyers on this stage who will represent you. I certainly think you're all strongest when you directly engage with one another. The parts where I found myself tuning out were there were stretches where you were talking about things the other side didn't disagree with and didn't particularly contend. And at that point, I'm like, that's phenomenally well argued, but not part of the debate. So you were very eloquent, but you weren't debating. And you were absolutely the strongest when you took on individual points. I also think, frankly, you were strongest when you were focused on the topic of the debate and not the sort of definitional cul-de-sacs, when you're engaging with the question of the principle and whether, as a principle, it should be part of humanitarian law. I am not a lawyer, so you actually had exactly as much, if not too much, legal analysis for my taste. But for me, you were strongest when you were engaging on that question of principle, because I think it's a really fundamental point, and there were some great arguments that came out on both sides.
Fair enough. Jessica?
Yes. You have a specific question or just anything?
Same question.
Well, first of all, I come from like debate world in Switzerland, and for me today was very, very interesting because on the one hand, my debate heart is like, oh, this is a really nice piece of analysis, and on the other hand, I could see that certain stretches of debate would maybe not be as convincing in sort of a political arena or just in terms of like public communication. So just one piece of observation, this was very, very interesting for me to watch. I come more from a British parliamentary format where you have to be more impromptu with how you like engage with the opponents because you only get the topic 15 minutes before the debate starts. So for me, there was not quite enough engagement from the two teams with each other because I could notice that you kind of spent a long time like preparing like your case. And so then it's very hard because you're like married to the case that you've prepared and that you've made. That also sounds really good, but at the same time, maybe the other team is kind of saying something completely different right now or trying to make a different point. And then it's just, unfortunately, not as convincing if you kind of forget to engage with it or you sort of ignore it in your speech because it happens to be inconvenient to your case. I'm not saying this happened like all the time. I think there were also, I mean, for goodness sake, one time someone said, okay, 5 points of rebuttal to like the point that was just made. So it's not that there was no engagement. For my taste, there could have been a little more.
All right. Frank, what did you think about the motion? Do you think it's an important question?
Wow, yes. Short answer. How many minutes do I have? No, first of all, I would like to congratulate here people, and I'm sorry, I'm realizing that I'm a bit old. Having young people come here on stage and debating this, first of all, chapeau, it's great. So it's great also the way you have been preparing and doing this, so congratulations to you all. I wish part of my job is sitting in big meetings of 1,000 people, and it's called debate, but it's just reading out statements, so I will send some of them to listen to you to make a real debate. The motion, I think the motion is extremely relevant. I'm with the International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent, and we are having strong delegations in the COP. We are with the communities and community level representing them, and climate change is one of the key areas, all communities around the world, and it has arrived in Europe as well. In Switzerland, the farmers last year were struggling. They're struggling on a high level, but they are struggling. Their livelihoods are also at risk. They are not at as much at risk as for the farmers in Africa and Asia, but it has arrived here as well. And so the debate is absolutely a must-have debate. So I think it's great that the Graduate Institute and the British Embassy have picked this up. I'm not saying in which direction I would tend of the debate here. And here, I must say, having prepared very well your arguments, but I agree with the others in terms of better engaging with each other and the arguments, that would have been extremely helpful for me finding my space here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dan, I'm going to leave the last question up to you, no pressure. Do you see a debate like this ever happening in the UN with such intensity? I mean, I think no, but...
Sure. Well, first of all, I just wanted to congratulate all of the participants. It was a really fascinating, and it was a fascinating debate. I learned quite a bit, and was really impressed by all the debaters and the teams. Unfortunately, I don't think these kinds of debates would go over very well in the UN, simply because everything is so formalized, and there is this lack of ability to respond to what the other side is saying. You have a situation where you're reading talking points and talking past each other rather than talking with each other. And that's why I wanted to highlight what my fellow jury members have said, is the importance of responding to the argumentation of the other team, because I think that is really where all of both the teams were most effective. It's the most concrete way you can win over someone like me who does not have a lot of expertise in this area, when you are taking something very concrete and responding directly to it for the layman. So I think that would be effective. But this is a long way of answering your question that, unfortunately, we don't have the benefit of having such fascinating debates at the UN. But I do think that there's certainly an opportunity to take lessons from this and have more constructive back and forth dialogue.
Thank you, I agree. With that, I would end this session. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Your input has been extremely, extremely appreciated. I would now invite you off the stage, and we can finally move on to the award ceremony. Right. I would like to now invite Deputy Ambassador Bill Longhurst and the Director of the Graduate Institute, Mary Lossell, onto the stage. Perfect. I guess, would you like to give a short statement? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Director Sal, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor and a pleasure to have co-organized this fantastic event with you all today. I'm under very strict instructions to keep my remarks very, very short because everyone is desperate to know who won. So I'll spare you the 45-minute lecture on the state of UK-Swiss relations, if you'll permit me. But I just wanted to say thank you to the Institute for hosting us. Thank you for the organisers, thank you for the audience for being with us, and particularly thank you to the debaters and the jurors. The debaters, I thought you did a fantastic job. I knew very little about this whole concept of ecocide and law beforehand. I know a lot more now. I think, like many in the audience, I found myself being swayed for and against the argument depending on who had just spoken, because you made such compelling arguments, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I thought the key takeaway is some justice better than no justice. I think that's something that resonated with me. But equally, I particularly liked your point that maybe international diplomacy is more effective than international law. But that's said with no self-interest whatsoever. Anyway, thank you very much again, and I'll hand over to Director.
Thank you very much, Deputy Ambassador. We'll start with a big thank you to everybody. Thank you also to the organizing team. I'll start with them because they've been working on that for many, many months, weeks. So a big thank you to you. Thank you very much to the two teams, the Geneva Graduate Institute team and the Oxford Union team. We're very happy to have been able to organize this inter-institution debate today. So this is great to see you today. Big thank you to jury members because they play an important part in all this, and a big thank you to all of you for being here today. I'll say a few words also. I won't be very long because everybody's starting to be a bit nervous, I'm sure. So I will, but nevertheless, I have to say a few words because those issues issues are very important, as you all know, to me and to the Institute today. I will distort the words of Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet had said, nothing is possible without individuals, nothing will last without institutions. And today I would like to say, nothing is possible without principles, and nothing will last without international collaboration and cooperation. So guys, actually, both of you, both teams won, I think. This is really what I want to say. Underscoring the fact that, in fact, if we are looking for justice, we probably need both. And we probably need to have the two articulate with each other in very powerful ways. We are humans. Humans, you know where it comes from, humus, Earth, you know, this is what we are. We are Peiche Elon Musk and his dreams of maybe another planet. We are stuck on this planet for quite a long time, fast forward. And certainly I won't see a planet B, and probably not you either. So this is the only planet we have. We cannot survive without the planet. The planet can probably do very well without us, but we cannot survive without the planet. So being humus on Earth, I think that, you know, well, I'm not sure this is really very much in the tradition, but I will make a case that indeed having a right to a healthy and resilient environment is a human right. It's certainly the way I see it for my children, for hopefully one day my grandchildren. And so, you know, I'm sorry to, you know, bet on one side of the debate, but I would like to make that case here. I know when I see all of you, when I heard you, when I see our students, more generally speaking, that this fight is in very good hands. Once again, I think there probably will be many different ways in which we can fight it, but it's very, very clear from your debate that you all agreed fundamentally that this is the fight that will occupy your generation, but also ours. I think we have to also keep working on that together for many, many years ahead. So thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to knowing who is winning, but again, I think you both won already.
All right, so we're going to start with Best Speaker. So the Best Speaker that was awarded is from the Oxford team, Samuel Scheuer. If you want to stay here, you can. Okay. I'm going to invite the debaters one by one because of the excellent performances you've anyway put up. Myrtle Cleo Priddy. Gabrielle Lin. Sohini Chakraborty. Heather Lee. and Jessica Curry. Right. Now, before I announce the best team and the winning team, I would like to first give a huge shout out to the organizing team and committee for the Geneva Debate for their tireless and absolutely phenomenal work for organizing this. For the majority of this organizing phase, I was not even in Geneva, and they've managed to pull this off flawlessly. And I can't thank them enough for actually pulling this off the way that they did. Okay, so the best team, the winning team for the Invitational Geneva Debate of 2023 is Oxford Union. Thank you so much for joining us. This was the first and hopefully one of many invitational debates we'll organize with some of the top universities in the world. We hope to see you next time. Thank you and good evening.